Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello. We'd like to start the program. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. We have a great program for you. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Network for Responsible Public Policy that is sponsoring or co-sponsoring this program. NFRPP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with the purpose of providing evidence-based, authoritative information on key public policy issues. In these days of so much disinformation and false information, our mission is to combat this distortion and to help mitigate the polarization and to foster knowledgeable voting and civic engagement. Our democracy really depends on that. So in the current charged political environment, with the information overload and the disinformation, and it's just very hard to find reliable information and just to sort through everything. So that's our mission. Our speakers are the ones who help us do this, and they are all authorities in their field. We also have other programs at other New Jersey locations, including Fairleigh Dickinson and Hackensack. These are evening programs, and we have flyers for the two upcoming ones on the table here and in the back. The March 21st one is on understanding systemic and cultural racism from our past to our present. And the one on April 18th is universal health care. Is Medicare for all the answer? So we also have some sign-up sheets. If you would like to receive our online newsletter where we tell you of upcoming events and recommend some good reading material, we have sign-up sheets here and on the back table. So you can do that after the program. So now I'll turn it over to Jonna, who will introduce our speaker.
Good morning. We are delighted to have as a speaker with us today Dr. Sally Roche Wagner. Dr. Wagner was awarded one of the first doctorates in the country for work in women's studies and was a founder of the first college-level women's studies program in the United States to offer students a minor in the discipline. She currently serves as an adjunct faculty member in the Renee Crown University Honors Program, Syracuse University, and the St. John Fisher Executive Leadership Program. She is the author of numerous women's history books and articles telling the untold stories. Her most recent publication is an intersectional women's suffrage movement anthology with a foreword by Gloria Steinem, just published by Penguin Classics. Dr. Wagner will be signing her books after the talk. Please welcome Dr. Sally Roche Wagner.
Good morning. I'm going to ask you to join me in doing something that I totally forgot to do before, which is to silence my cell phone. So, once I do that, I'll be ready. I want to thank Edie and Jonna and especially honored to be speaking as part of the Network for Responsible Public Policy and here at the Teaneck Library. I think, it really is a moment when it's so critical, as Edie said, that we explore the differences that we have and that we base our decisions on real information, not the lies that are passing for truth today. So I'm honored to be part of this tradition. Okay, you're ready to play Suffrage Myth busters with me? We're going to have a little game today. I don't know about you, but when I was studying women's history, I learned a story that's essentially what my students at Syracuse University are learning today. And that is, the suffrage movement can be told in this simple way. Begins in 1848, two women carry it through, two white women carry it through to victory in 1920, and that's about the end of it, huh? Is that the beginning and the end? 1848, 1920, two white women, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, boom, we've covered it. Well, every part of that is wrong. And that's what I'm going to try to convince you of today. I don't expect you to take it on faith. If you check the book out from the Teaneck Library, which I'll make sure when I leave they have one, or if you want to buy one, read the evidence for yourself, because the book is really, most history is told, this is what happened, trust me, okay? This book gives you the voices of the women and men themselves, so you can make the decision for yourself. But what I'm going to share with you today is the sort of takeaways that I have from having done this 500-page anthology. I can't tell you how many things I had to cut. It was painful. The book is very new, and so am I to the talking about it. The book dropped last week. We had a sold-out 500-person auditorium launch at the New School last Friday. And this is only my second actual talk. I've done a couple panels, but so if you'll bear with me, you're getting it fresh. First of all, 1848. What's wrong with this picture? Did history begin on this soil when white people came here? That sort of arrogant history we're really beginning to question, rightfully so. Women had political voice on this land at least 1,000 years ago. Next year, we're celebrating 100 years in the United States. The Haudenosaunee women, the people of the Longhouse, in the area that's now upstate New York, those women for 1,000 years have had political voice, at least. The founding of the Confederacy, the Six Nation Iroquois Confederacy, about 1,000 years ago. The clan mothers to this day continue to nominate, hold in position, and remove, if necessary, the chiefs or the sachems that they have set up as the decision makers for their clan. 1,000 years of doing this, and it still goes on today. And you know what? One of the major issues that are absolutely essential for a leader in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, he cannot have abused a woman. If he's abused a woman, he can no longer be in that position. And if knowledge of him having done that is common or anyone knows it, he will never be considered for a chief. Looks kind of good, doesn't it? So we don't begin with 1848. We really begin with the process that happens before white people reach this land. Then we come into colonial time. Oh, you know what I want to do? I am going to give you a little assist here. These women, the Haudenosaunee women, really influenced and inspired, I think, the suffrage movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who was one of the three triumvirate leadership of the National Women's Suffrage Association, along with Stanton and Anthony. Stanton, Gage, Mott, Mott spent the month before she came to plan the Seneca Falls Convention. They just sort of accidentally decided they'd do it. She had spent a month with the women at Cattaraugus, which is a Seneca community, one of the 6 nations of the Confederacy. And Mott, in the only document I found where she describes her summer, spends about 3 paragraphs in her letter to the anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, about 3 paragraphs on her experience with the Seneca, and 1 little paragraph about the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, I don't know if that's the relative, importance she placed on these events, but that's the document. I want to read you one of the things that Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote. She said, of the Senecas of North America, the Reverend Arthur Wright, it's actually Asher Wright, wrote in 1873, as to their family system, when occupying the old longhouses, it is probable that some one clan predominated, the women taking in husbands, however, from other clans. In other words, a longhouse consisted of the mother, the father, the married sisters and their husbands and the children, and the unmarried brothers. When the brothers married, they would go live in the longhouse of their wives. The children were in the female line. She goes on to say, usually the females ruled the house. The stores were in common, but woe to the luckless husband or lover who was too shiftless to do his share of the providing. No matter how many children or whatever goods he might have in the house, he might at any time be ordered to pick up his blanket and budge. And after such an order, it would not be healthy for him to attempt to disobey. The house would be too hot for him. The women were the great power among the clan as everywhere else. They did not hesitate, when occasion required, to knock off the horns, as it was technically called, from the head of a chief and send him back to the ranks of the warriors. The original nomination of the chiefs also always rested with the women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, I want you to think for a minute about what this would have meant for these white women to know Haudenosaunee women. The white women had no right to their bodies. They had no right to their children. Husbands could will away an unborn child. That child would be taken away from the mother and given to the rightful owner when it was born. Women had no right to their property. Anything you earned became your husband's. You couldn't vote, or you couldn't sue or be sued. You simply did not exist legally. Under the Blackstone Code, you were considered dead in the law. You did not exist. Stan is really impressed with these women, tossing the belongings outside of these men who are misbehaving, because divorce was not possible. Canon law became the foundation for common law, and the two shall become one, and the one is the man, and the woman shall be under the authority of the man, as the Bible says, all the way from, Genesis with the sin of Eve, all the way to St. Paul. That's the foundation of Western law in the United States, certainly. So these women who are sort of locked into loveless and dangerous marriages in which they cease to exist legally, even if they're in a happy marriage, they have no legal existence. Imagine what it was for them to know, personally, spend time with women who had political voice, who had spiritual voice, who had social. They were the agriculturalists, which meant essentially they controlled the economy as well. And the spiritual authority, women planned all the ceremonies. This was at a time when in the United States not a single woman could speak in a pulpit. The Quakers, anyone could speak, but it wasn't from a pulpit. So this, I think, was the fire that inspired and sparked the women's movement. I think in 2020, we begin the process by thanking Native women for the vision that we then attempted to follow. Sad part of the story, the accountability part of the story, is that at the same time we were learning from them, we were attempting to destroy that very thing that we were learning from. The boarding school, the colonization, the Christianize and civilize policy of the United States government and the churches destroyed, not completely, because these clan mothers at Onondaga and the Mohawk communities, in the traditional communities, the clan mothers are still carrying out their responsibilities and the balance of authority, men and women. So, we're not at 1848, right? We're 1,000 years before. Then we come to the colonial period where women voted. Property qualifications. If you had enough property, if you were a man or a woman, you could vote. Not every woman, but women did vote in the colonies. In fact, there was one protest where the women said, you know what? We are paying taxes, but we're not being allowed to vote. You better let us vote. 1848, we're still not there yet, because we have the colonial period, and the suffragists knew this. I don't think we knew it, did we? You know, those of us who are the sort of second wave of feminists, I never knew that women voted in the colonies, or that the suffragists said, we are not asking for a new right. We are asking for the restitution of a right that our foremothers had. We're still not ready for 1848, because first we have the female anti-slavery societies. First one formed in Salem, Massachusetts by African American women. It becomes mixed. It's African American and white women all over the North they're forming. They have over 150 organizations by 1837, and they form a national organization. These women are learning their voices, they're learning organizing. These are the skills they bring into the women's rights movement. It doesn't just spring up in 1848. You know, 4 of the planners of the Seneca Falls Convention, not Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but the 4 Quaker women that plan it, they are all veterans of the female anti-slavery societies. And they are, you know, sophisticated organizers by this point. These women in the female anti-slavery societies raise one issue of women's rights that is a primary one. And it's one that was astounding to me to realize that in 1837, when I thought women, white women especially, could never speak about anything having to do with sex, right? You know what they're calling out? The institutionalized rape of enslaved women. 1837. These are the voices, and this is the issue. In fact, that may be the first organized issue of women's rights that is raised in the United States, and it is a decade before Seneca Falls, and it is the institutionalized rape of enslaved women. It is part and parcel, they say, of the institution of enslavement. So we're already tired and we're not even to 1848 yet. Well, I have to tell you what I say in the book and what I think may be the fact. 1848 was a local convention. The reason we know that as the first is because Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was one of the planners, was one of the authors of the history of women's suffrage. You know, and she's telling the story that she knows. But here's what I'm waiting for. There's going to be a 4th grader in New Jersey who is going to be doing a History Day project, who is going to be going through the Teaneck or some other newspaper from the time and is going to find that, wow, guess what? The women of Teaneck had a women's rights meeting in 1845. I think history that we have is there's these sort of guide points along the way, but sometimes they're kind of arbitrary. The thing that really begins the organized women's movement is the first national convention that's held in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850. And then it absolutely explodes, just like the second wave of feminism did. And I'm looking around and I'm recognizing that there are some of us who are veterans of that moment and proud ones. Raise your hand with me. Those of you who are part of the beginning of, these are the foremothers that we can look to. Thank you. So they raised the issues that we raised in the late 60s, early 70s. We had no idea that our foremothers had raised them. Equal pay for equal work was echoed in almost every single women's rights convention in the 1850s. Women then made a third to a half of what men made. 150 years later, where are we? We're a little over 75%, but for women of color, it is not even that high. Is it going to be another 150 years before we get pay equity? No. There's nothing inevitable about this slow pace with which women in the United States are gaining our rights, and it's to the embarrassment of ourselves because the rest of the world is so far ahead of us on every single issue of women's rights. We're what, 75th out of 192 countries in terms of women in political positions? Nah, we need to be doing better than we're doing. So, equal rights, equal pay, job equity generally, reproductive choice. This issue gets raised as early as 1850. And once we get to the 70s and 80s, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage and many of the other suffragists saying, we believe in the rights of the unborn. And do you know what the most sacred of those rights is? The right to be wanted and to be chosen. Every child born has the right to be wanted and welcomed into the world, never forced, never by accident. What is the implication of that? Women have to control their own bodies. It can't be the church, it can't be the state. That was the position of the most progressive of the suffragists. Now along comes the Civil War. So the 50s is, the other thing I need to tell you is that abolition and women's rights are marching arm in arm through the 1850s. You had an abolitionist convention, the American Anti-Slavery Association. I have to get these names. You had the American Anti-Slavery Society and the women's rights meetings, the women's rights yearly conventions, happening concurrently so that you could go to both conventions, because you scratch an abolitionist, you find a women's rights advocate. You scratch a women's rights advocate, you find an abolitionist. They are one and the same, working together through the 1850s. Then comes the Civil War. The women say, you know what, we're going to stop our conventions, we're going to stop our work, and we are going to support the war effort. But, and this is a really big but, we are not going to support it for the reasons that Abraham Lincoln is saying the war is being fought. Lincoln was saying the war is being fought to preserve the Union. And they said, we will only support this war as long as it is being fought to end slavery. 400,000 signatures. This is the largest number of signatures that have ever been gathered on United States soil. That's the work of the women. And you know all the other things they did. Everything from Harriet Tubman, planning and carrying out the first military campaign that a woman ever has in the country, to Anna Ella Carroll planning the Tennessee campaign. Lincoln said at the time, we can't let people know that this major campaign that changed the course of the world was planned by a woman. And that's, a civilian, and the civilian, a woman, no less. So after the war, we will let people know. Well, after the war, Lincoln wasn't around. And she gets lost to history. Now, the war's ended, and we have this difficult period, right? Because the Constitution was a slavery document. Enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person. For the purpose of, no, men and women, the enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person. For, you're right, we'll get to that in a minute, about who gets the vote. But it's necessary, of course, to remove this. You can't just count everybody. Women are counted as full citizens, right, for the purpose of representation, even though they aren't able to vote. African Americans are counted as 3/5 of a person if they're enslaved. So we've got to change the Constitution. Well, we change the Constitution. This is a moment. The abolitionists and the women's rights advocates come together, and they say, you know what? This is a moment when, I think Theodore Tilton said it best. He said, this is the door of freedom has swung open. And the woman and the Negro can walk through it arm in arm. This is the moment for universal suffrage. So the abolitionists and the women's rights advocates come together, form the American Equal Rights Association, and they work for universal suffrage. And then the radical Republicans who control Congress, screw them. What they do is say, you know what, we're only going to let the African-American man walk through the door of freedom, and we're going to slam the door shut in the face of women, because not only are we going to say they can't vote, but we're going to pass an enabling amendment that will make sure that African-American men are protected from the states that may try to stop them from voting. But, oh dear, we're going to have to define who citizens are for the purpose of ensuring their safety in voting. And if we just say citizens, that means women are going to be able to vote too. So you know what? We're going to have to call citizens male. Constitution never seen gender in it before. And now all of a sudden it says male citizens, male citizens, male citizens, 3 times, throwing into question whether women are even citizens of the United States. Now, racism rose its ugly head in that moment. And I think we can point fingers at Susan B. Anthony, we can point fingers in this moment at Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but I think our most fingers should be pointed at Congress, which created a divide and conquer. It separated this brilliant, powerful coalition by saying, nope, you're in, you're out. It's an ugly moment. It's a painful moment, and it set us on a path. But what came out of it was that, it was mixed. I mean, Robert Purvis, who's an African-American man, says, I have a son and a daughter. I would rather that my son wait 50 years to get the vote than that my daughter wait 1 more minute, because as a Negro and as a woman, she is doubly in need of the protection of the ballot. So it wasn't divided white and black. It wasn't divided man and woman. It's a really complicated moment because how are you going to choose which side you're going to be on? Well, the result was a division into two women's rights organizations, the National and the American. The National is the one that we really know as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Matilda Joslyn Gage. It's most of the major suffragists of the 1850s. The other is Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, more conservative. Big difference between the two groups. The National is fighting for a federal amendment. The 16th Amendment was actually introduced at this same time. Congress could have passed a woman's suffrage amendment, the 16th Amendment, and we could have had the vote in 1868. Didn't go anywhere. Didn't go anywhere. Congress wouldn't really even consider it. So we have the National Women's Suffrage Association saying, we are fighting for this 16th Amendment. The American, on the other hand, said, no, we're going to look to get the vote state by state. Well, this is a moment when the country is really divided about who can decide who is allowed to vote. Should it be the feds or should it be the states? And once you have the 15th Amendment, the feds are saying, we decide who can vote, because they did that with African American men. But think about the implications of this for a minute. If you say, please give me the right to vote, aren't you also saying, you give me the right to vote, you can take it away from African American men? States' rights position of the American really strengthens the Southern racists who immediately implement every voter registration they can. Now, the 1870s, I just want to shout out a couple of the amazing things that the National is doing, I think. They carried out a campaign of nonviolent civil disobedience. We hear about Susan B. Anthony voting, right? 1868, women in New Jersey already were voting or trying to. She's not until 72, I think, is her vote. By that time, there have been hundreds of thousands, maybe thousands of women around the country who have attempted to vote or who have voted in all kinds of elections, local, state, federal. So here's how it comes down. The women say, look, we are citizens of a republic based on the consent of the governed. How is consent given? Through the ballot. Do women have the right to vote? Yes. If this is a republic, then yes, we have the right to vote. So you guys put up or shut up. Either you're a republic or you're not. If you are, we're voting. So they went to the voting booths and they said, you know what? We're not the lawbreakers, even though it was against the law in every state. Now, there were a couple territories, Wyoming in '69, that gave women the vote, but you couldn't vote man or woman for Congress or president in a territory. Still can't. Puerto Rico, is out because of that reason. So no woman could vote in any state in the United States legally. But what the women said was, we're not the lawbreakers. The lawbreakers is the federal government that's failing to protect us in our right to the ballot. They said, hey, 14th Amendment applies to us. I don't care about that woman crap you put in there. We're citizens and we need to be protected. So they voted, or they sued the registrars that refused to let them vote. Virginia Minor's husband, because she couldn't, she was a married woman, took her case all the way to the Supreme Court. Minor versus Happersett, 1875. Virginia Minor sued Reese Happersett for $10,000 for refusing to let her register to vote. Supreme Court, 9 white guys, unanimously said, if there is one case that can be said to be settled now and forever, it is this one. Women do not have the right to vote protected in the United States of America. 1875, Minor versus Happersett. So, what else do they do? The anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, they begin a tax protest campaign. Women across the country refusing to pay their taxes. No taxation without representation. If it was good enough for the founding fathers, it's good enough for us. They also, 1876, the centennial, they wrote a Declaration of Rights of Women, and they asked for permission to present it. They were denied. They went ahead and presented it anyway, knowing they might be arrested. They said, we did it not for the women of our time, but for the daughters of 1976, so they would know that their mothers of 1876 had impeached the government for its treatment of women. They did it for us. But of course, you knew that. You heard that in school and read all that. This is all old hat to you, right? Statue of Liberty goes up in the New York Harbor, and they protest that, saying, this is the greatest hypocrisy of the 19th century, that liberty is represented as a woman in a land where not a single woman has political liberty. These were kick-ass women. And they were making real progress in terms of the federal amendment. Not a whole lot of progress with the states, but a lot of progress with the federal amendment. They were getting hearings before the Senate. You know, they were getting, slowly inching their way to better votes. And this I'm going to consolidate because this is the part that I really want you to read, because this is the painful part of the women's movement. We have all these wonderful things and all these wonderful women to celebrate, African American and white women. There were so many African American women and men that were part of the movement. I'm just going to shout out a few, okay? One of my favorites, it's like I'm being asked on all these radio shows, who would you most like to have lunch with? And I'll tell you the truth, it's Mary Ann Shadd Cary. You know her? Anybody here know that name? Well, you're going to go away knowing her. Mary Ann Shadd Cary was the first woman to edit, the first African American woman to edit a weekly newspaper in the North American continent. In Canada. She comes back to the U.S. and becomes a recruiter of African American soldiers during the Civil War. She goes on to law school. She becomes an attorney. She's been a teacher, and she is a strong member of the National Women's Suffrage Association. The entire Purvis family, the Fortons, who are intermarried with the Purvises, Sarah Ramond and her brother Charles, the Rollins sisters in South Carolina, who are political operatives in the Republican Party, which was the Progressive Party at the time. I could just go on. And this is before, this is even before, I think this is by 1880. They're working together, and there are so many women to shout out, white as well as African American, and it's men as well as women. And I think that's what we need to remember. Women never would have gotten the vote if men hadn't voted to give women the vote. We fought hard for it, but it was women and male allies who did that. Now we come to 1889, and Susan B. Anthony has a vision of the vote. For Anthony, the one thing we need is the vote. Once we get the vote, everything else will be settled. She doesn't even want any progress to be made legislatively, and cuts off the legislative committee's work because she wants everything focused on the vote. Well, her idea is, look, let's all come back together. Let's bring the American and the national back together. And she really engineers a merger between the American and the national. There's one serious problem here, in addition to the fact that it's really not a merger. It's a states' rights takeover that is like, it follows the American tradition of states' rights. But the other thing is it brings in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And the WCTU is an organized army of mother love that's doing some very good social justice work, but they want to get women the vote so that women will put God in the Constitution and a very conservative, fundamentalist Jesus Christ interpretation as the head of the government. This would destroy the wall of separation between church and state. They are a very powerful group. I think they have 100,000 members at some point. Anthony sees numbers. She sees, we bring these women in, we're going to have that many more women to fight for the vote. Well, of course, what it does is it just electrifies the liquor industry, which is because the WCTU wants to abolish liquor and get prohibition passed, which actually passes before women's rights. So you bring in this sleeping enemy who is well funded, and you create an enemy that is going to be very hard to defeat. But the worst thing that happens in this merger is that racism becomes policy of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And I want to tell you what I mean by that. They make the argument, give women the right to vote because white women outnumber Negroes and immigrants, and women's suffrage is a way to maintain white, native-born supremacy. They practice states' rights. That means that the state societies are free to do whatever they want. And especially in the South, there are state societies that work for the vote for white women only, that work for Jim Crow voter suppression laws, and that segregate and don't allow African American women to be part of their organization. Nationally, the National American will not take on any issues that deal with the oppression of African Americans. Ida B. Wells, good friend of Susan B. Anthony makes it clear lynching is not an issue for the women's rights movement. I think about how many lives of African American men might have been saved if the women's suffrage movement had fought against lynching side by side with Ida B. Wells and the African American women and men. I think accountability in history is both what you do, and the effect of the National American has been to divide African American and white women in incredibly painful ways. Part of the reason that voter suppression laws continued so strong, that African American women and men really didn't get the vote in 1920. They really didn't get the vote until the 1960s, when the Voting Rights Acts were passed and the Jim Crow laws were abolished. We are still dealing with voter suppression today. And how strong would those voter suppression laws be? Would they be this strong, and would they have lasted so long if the women suffragists in the South had not fought for them? We are part of the problem. We're part of the problem because we continue that legacy of racism. Now, what do we do for 2020 next year? This is, for me, and I think for the women's movement generally, it's a dilemma. Can we really celebrate if not everybody's at the table? If we say this is the moment that women got the vote, well, Chinese or Asian women didn't get the vote until they were finally given citizenship in the 1940s. Handicapped women didn't get to vote until the 1970s with the laws. 1920 marks a movement, a moment in the history of democracy. It is not an endpoint. And if we call it an endpoint, we're saying you're not at the table with us. This is a celebration of white women, privileged white women. I think before we can move to the celebration, we need to have a truth and reconciliation. We need to tell the truth about the racism of the movement. We need to apologize to the Native women for having denied them a place in the history, and we need to thank them for the vision that they've given us. I think we need to take accountability and say we will no longer be a people that sees the world in that way. We will no longer be a movement that practices racism as policy. And I think then maybe we can have a celebration of the good things that were done by African American women and men and by white women and men, the strength, the courage that they had. But I don't think we have a right to celebrate until we have that truth and reconciliation process so that everybody is at the table. I'd like to end with the last words in my book, if I could. After calling for the truth and reconciliation and thinking about what could have been, I say, we the people determine history by our choices. One person's boldness can fire others. Two means someone has that person's back. A dozen can start a movement. 100 can swing an election. 1,000 can change the course of history. Individually, by our actions or our lack of action, we are a part of determining the world our children's children will inhabit. Can we do better than our foremothers and forefathers? The opportunity to do so is the gift we are given and the responsibility. Thank you. Thank you. So you're brimming over with questions and opinions and ideas, yes.
Did European women in various countries get the vote before American women did?
Did European women get the vote before American women did? Women in Russia got the vote before American women did, for God's sake. I mean, we were way, way down there on the totem pole on that one as well. Yeah, and you know, how many countries have had presidents that are women? And yeah, we kind of have not. It's just, we have to stop embarrassing ourselves in the eyes of the world by saying we are the pillars of democracy when we're talking a good talk, but we ain't walking the walk. Yes.
How did it work when women were not married and they inherited property? Could they vote at that time?
No. During the colonies, in the colonial period, if women inherited property and they were independent, in some of the colonies, they voted, yes. But once the states passed their constitutions after the Revolution, every state, I think New Jersey, I think you were last in 1804, but every state passed a law that said that women and African American men couldn't vote.
There was a movement of women who did not marry
Mm-hmm.
and signed contracts that they would not marry because it was an oppressive state.
Can you either speak louder or let's do mic check? I have a hearing issue, so sorry. Can this be moved? Or maybe, can you just shout it out? Great.
There was a
Everybody quiet and we're going to hear.
There was a movement of women that would contracted among themselves not to marry because they realized that they lost all their rights. Was this ever spoken of in large numbers?
You know, I don't know of a movement, an organized movement of that, but women definitely did that, made that choice. Women of means, only women of means would have been able to make that choice. Yeah. The other thing was, even if you had means, the social pressure to marry was so strong. I mean, the worst thing you could be called was an old maid. And you were an old maid by 20 if you hadn't married. So, you know, the pressure was really intense to marry. But yeah, you know, and the other thing is that I think they didn't have the awareness that you have in this room today of what their position was. It was the norm. It just was what it was. And women might not even, I mean, women who had their children taken away from them, they didn't know that was the law. Women whose husbands died and left everything, you know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton has a story about her father, you know, she's hiding in her father's study. He was an attorney, later a judge, and he, you know, he's talking to this woman and she leaves in tears. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you know, outs herself and says, "Why do you make these women cry?" And he said, "It's not me, it's the law." And he points out that the woman that he had just talked to she lived in this mansion on the Hudson, was a very, very wealthy woman, but her husband had died and left everything to her son, or to his son, who was a ne'er-do-well, and he'd kicked his mother out of the house. And so even though she was an incredibly wealthy woman, she was homeless and she was penniless. And so, you know, they didn't know this until it hit them in the face. It was just, that's the way it was. Husbands beat their wives, wasn't against the law. Husbands raped their wives, wasn't against the law. That just is the way it was. Yes?
Can you comment on the Lilly Ledbetter law that was supposed to equal women's pay, equal pay?
Ah. I think there is someone here who may be better qualified than I am. Do you want
Well,
to speak to
there
that?
was a law, it was the first one that President Obama signed in his first
Mm-hmm.
term, which was good to remedy some of the worst parts of that decision. Lilly Ledbetter didn't get her back pay and so on. But what that law did was remove a time limit and various things. It still didn't do too much in the way of completely undercutting the inequities of the practice of that pay inequity. So there is something called fair paycheck. There is still something in, maybe somebody else here knows, that needs to be passed before that really does away with all of the inequity around cases like hers. So.
And of course, the Equal Rights Amendment would give us a little bit of leverage in that
How did I make
case.
that?
Bobby has worked on the Equal Rights Amendment for a good portion of her life, so I just had to add that on. But I want to say this. If we even take 1848 as the starting point, it was 72 years. 1850, it was 70 years. Women working and men allies for getting a constitutional amendment that was the beginning of protection. It wasn't, you know, I think Stanton said, you know, the vote isn't even a half a loaf, it's a crumb. It is just a tool that we can use. The Equal Rights Amendment is the same thing, but a necessary tool. But how many years? 1923 was when it was introduced. It is now what? 2019? Do the math. 90?
Longer than the vote.
Yeah, 90,
Those dates.
96 years as opposed to 72. 96 years. We have been fighting for equal rights to be embedded in the Constitution, and we still don't have it.
Republicans killed it. I remember the vote.
The radical Republicans? Yeah.
But I just put in that
Sure.
people should keep an eye on the news, because while there was a deadline in 1982, two more states Nevada in 2017 and Illinois last year have ratified with one more state, then it will be the 38 that are needed. So keep your eye, you don't see much in the mainstream media, but things have been happening. The deadline that was on it, there is argument, could be superseded. And so juicy things will happen with the ERA imminently.
Yeah, I think you have,
Virginia's
Yeah,
coming.
I was wondering, a lot of young people, a lot of young women don't vote and don't seem to care about the vote and don't know anything about the history. What happened?
well, you know, what did we learn about women's history in school, and what are they learning? I think that's part of it. But the other thing is, I mean, think about the energized women that came out in 2018, that came out in 2016. You know, I teach young women, and I am absolutely, you know, inspired by their passion, their commitment, their anger, their, you know, I think it may be a myth that we held before 2016 that they weren't involved. I think we,
Several of them that just totally were not.
I'm sure there are some,
So
yeah,
they might have changed after 2016.
and they're,
Before 2016,
yes, exactly, yep. I think 2016 is what's really, you know, I just want to say this. I have never known a better organizer for social justice than Donald Trump. He's doing a lot of damage, but he has mobilized us as I've never seen mobilization. Yes,
You made a humorous remark about Teaneck in 1845, but I would just like to take this opportunity to say Teaneck will be celebrating its 125th anniversary very soon, in which I hope you will all participate in February, okay? And so I just, in the interest of truth, we didn't exist in 1845 as we do today.
okay, thanks. One more, and then maybe we can just more informally. Oh, we've got two more, okay.
Will the progress of women at the present time in our military services help the cause of women in general?
You know, I don't know exactly how to answer that. I think that, you know, the Mother's Day was originally started as a peace day. And the National American, in its good work, worked for universal peace. You know, for me, it's a mixed bag personally, that it's like, you know, you work to elevate every woman in every position, but at the same time, you work to end war as a solution to problems. The first woman to actually carry on a presidential campaign was Belva Lockwood in 1884, and part of her platform was war is a barbarism of the past, and she was part of the Universal Peace Movement, which had as its goal mandatory binding arbitration worldwide of all disputes, which would have just taken war off you know, it would not have been one of the options available. A question or comment way back here.
Well, I'm the mother of a son, and I have beautiful, very courageous nieces. But I was wondering, is there any documentation about the husbands of these very courageous women? You know, how they help them, how the men help them. Did they have organizations to help the women, lawyers?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, one example is you know, Francis Minor, who took the case to the Supreme Court for Virginia Minor, the Minor versus Habersat, and he really developed that women voting under the 14th Amendment process. I'll shout out to one man. I love a bunch of these dead guys, you know, love a whole lot of the dead women, but there's some damn good dead guys too. And one of them is Samuel J. May, who in 1845, date it 3 years before Seneca Falls, does a sermon in his pulpit in Syracuse, New York, in which he says, You know, the Constitutional Convention just denied women the right to vote in New York State. I want you men to think about how you would feel if your wife made all the decisions for you. Think about that for a minute. And then he said, men need to become more Christ-like and women need to become more aggressive. One other man to shout out to, Frederick Douglass. 1847, year before Seneca Falls, the masthead of his newspaper read, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color." He put the cause of women before his very own cause. Yeah. I think we have one more burning question and then we will break.
I think that one of the things that we've seen since 2016 is the number of women recently who have come into office.
Yes.
And I just wanted to give a shout out tonight to the Ethical Culture Society in Teaneck. There are going to be 4 women speaking, including Senator Weinberg, about why they got into office and how that happened. And the historians are also going to be performing there.
That's great.
But that wasn't my question. I just want to let people know.
Thank you.
7:30 tonight.
Appreciate
The
that.
question I have is, and I think maybe this speaks to the issue of intersectionality.
Yes.
And also to youth, because I think the biggest dialogue I've had recently with younger people is the definition of feminism. That young women don't see themselves as feminists, and in fact, they see feminism as a negative thing. Now, so how the women's movement evolved, that's the question. How did it evolve to get to the point where feminism is now seen as negative by younger people? That was the question.
And I think it's not the evolution of feminism, it's the evolution of the backlash. You know, I think when Rush Limbaugh in the 80s called us feminazis and feminism became a bad word, well, I think that we're on the upswing again because Beyonce is defining herself as a feminist. President Obama defined himself as a feminist. And what I'm finding with my students is that maybe 10 years ago, they were embarrassed to say they were taking my class, and the name of it, feminism in it. Today, they're proud to, and they're good to do it. So I think that there really is a shift as culturally, feminism now is becoming more, we could go on forever. I know that you all need to leave, but please come up and I'll sign books and